I know, that's weird. I'll get to it in a minute.
Hi.
Hi, come on in.
Sorry you're late.
That's okay. But you only get like one late per term, so unfortunately you've used your one late already, but you know.
Sorry.
Yeah, that's okay, Maya. First day, everybody's trying to figure out what their classes are. I know I was. I didn't know what room we were in until about 10 minutes ago. All right, I'll just let people get settled and then we'll kind of get started here. All right. You all look so much bigger in real life. So, well, welcome back to school here. Some of you, who's this is their first day back. Woo! So exciting. And some of you were here yesterday as well, I guess. Is that true? Or you've been here before? Okay. Very cool. So how is it so far? Bad? No? How is it? Is it okay? Exciting? But also, is anyone like a little bit like worried about getting sick? No? Yeah? Yeah, well, me too. Me too, right? Especially, this is probably the most people I've been in the same room with for quite some time. So, yeah, hopefully everything will be okay. But we can all kind of do our part to keep everybody safe, right? So I noticed that, not you, you're okay. I noticed that, wow, I didn't know I had that power. I just pointed at him and he stopped. I'm like a god. No. So keep in mind that, you know, while we're in the building, you've got to wear your masks all the time unless you're taking a sip of something or eating. I know some people are kind of, you know, the mask comes off a lot in the hallways or in the student lounge. You're all very beautiful and handsome, and so I know it's a crime to cover up, you know, your beautiful faces, but you know, we have to, so please wear them all the time. And if you see other people, you know, just kind of, if you feel comfortable, just remind them to mask up. If you don't, you know, I don't want you to be, you know, the Columbia College police force on this, but, you know, if you feel comfortable reminding someone, please do it, because that will ensure that as few people get sick as possible. I'm sure that none of us really want to get sick. I know that I don't, and my goal is not to. So, yeah, let's just be careful and keep our fingers crossed, and hopefully we'll be okay. Just so you know what's going on up here, I'm not so narcissistic and vain that I need to have like my face everywhere. Although, right? I'm not like that, am I?
Sometimes you are.
Sometimes? Really? But as you all already know, we were online, and I did the live stream on YouTube, and so that's kind of what's happening now. I don't think nobody's watching online right now, so that's fine. But again, if one or a number of us get sick during the term, of course you'll have to isolate, you'll have to stay home, but you can still participate in class through the live stream. So I'll continue to kind of be in here and I'll teach like this, but I'll also run the live stream too, so that should anyone have to stay home, they don't miss anything, okay? So today it's not really necessary, but I've kind of been doing this live stream thing now for a year and a half, so I'm very, there's Jarek is there, even though he's not in this class, but hi Jarek. You know Jarek.
Yeah.
Jarek, Maya's here. So yeah, so I'll continue to do this live stream thing while we're in class, okay? Just so you know, we are broadcasting this to the entire universe, but of course nobody can really see you, right? The camera is always on me, and people can't really hear you on the live stream either. So even if we have people, kind of listening at home, and I ask you a question and you want to answer it, you can answer it and kind of feel comfortable that you're not broadcasting your voice to the entire universe. So it's really, people can just hear me. Okay, so say whatever you want. You're safe and you can feel comfortable that way. Also, let's face it, the entire universe is not watching my YouTube channel, right? It's nobody nobody watches this channel, so it's fine. But just in case you're a little self-conscious about that, nobody can hear you but me. And you know, if people are online and you say something, I'll kind of relay it to people online. So don't worry, you're not on camera. People can't hear you. You can act and say whatever you feel you want to, and yeah, it'll stay off the internet. Okay, it's only me. Anyone have any questions before we start? Officially? No? Okay. Let's start it off. So, yes. So on Friday we had some internet lagging issues, and unfortunately I was a little bit confused because what happened was that we went on break, we came back, and I was going to ask you to read this article. And so I was in the process of giving you instructions, and I think that's where the live stream kind of stopped or started to lag, and so you didn't really hear my instructions. And then when I thought you were reading, in fact you were kind of sitting waiting for the stream to start again, and so it took me a few minutes to kind of figure out what was going on, and then we just kind of ended it early. But hopefully you've read this article. Show of hands, have you read this thing? Honestly? Okay, so what I'd like you to do is, if you've read it already, just give it a quick scan before we start. I want to just give you like 5 or 6 minutes to look over it again, because we just kind of started here. If you didn't read it, I would try and read fast if you can. But after that, we'll start talking about the questions, okay? So I'm just going to put 5 minutes on the clock here, and that will allow us to refresh our memories. I'll refresh my memory too, then we'll talk, okay? All right. Hey, come on in. That's okay. Well, I think oh good, we do have enough seats left. There's not many, but we're just taking a quick read over that article that we were supposed to read at the end of last class, and then we're going to talk about it. What's up? Okay, so hopefully that's enough time. My fingers are crossed. I'm going to hope most people read it. Let's talk about this. Now, there's lots of things to talk about in this article, and maybe it doesn't seem like it, but there actually are. So the context of this, of course, is that famed anthropologist Branislaw Malinowski went to the Trobriand Islands in the early 1900s. He wrote a very popular and sort of seminal work in the field called Argonauts of the West Pacific. He's a big deal in anthropology, Branislaw Malinowski is. And so he went to these islands, learned about the culture of these Trobriand Islanders. He went there, wrote the book, and here anthropologist Annette Weiner goes back to the same place, I don't know, 50 or 60 years later, right? To do the same thing, to do anthropology, to learn about Trobriand culture. And interestingly, she kind of sees some of the same things, but she also sees some different things as well, which is very interesting. But first of all, when she begins her field work in the Trobriand Islands, what does she have to do in order to understand the cultural meanings of these Trobrianders? What does she say she has to do? Yeah.
She has to let go of her own cultural assumptions to understand their culture better.
Right. So this is a tricky thing, right? Because we know that our culture has taught us beliefs and values and what things mean and what kind of symbols, how to interpret symbols. We've learned a massive, massive amount. And for someone like Annette here, Annette has to go to a place which is totally foreign to her, which I'm sure that maybe many of you can relate to. But you have to go to a place now that's totally foreign to you, and you have to learn new cultural meanings, right? You have to learn and understand how people do things and what they believe and what's good and what's bad and why they think the things that they do. And again, many of you are probably at some point in this process already. And that's a big thing, right? Because we said that culture is our operating system, right? And so almost what we're asking Annette to do is like deprogram herself, right? We're asking her to take her operating system away so that she can see the Trobrianders in an unbiased way, right? In an objective way, in a way that's not kind of colored by her own culture. Now, do you think that's possible? Do you think we can deprogram ourselves that way? No? I don't think so either. Once upon a time, anthropologists thought that they could. Anthropologists thought that they could be objective and unbiased, right? And I think most anthropologists today would tell you that that's just not possible, right? You can't divorce yourself from your operating system, right? We know the things that we know, right? We look at things the way that we look at things. It doesn't mean we can't learn new ways to see things, and it doesn't mean that we can't change the way we see things, but we're always going to kind of look at things through a certain kind of lens, right? And really the best we can do is understand the way our culture looks at the world, right? We need to understand our own bias, right? How does my culture see this versus how did the Trobrians see it, right? And so again, we can't really act in an unbiased way. All we can do is just kind of understand our own bias, right? Understand that when we look at the Trobriand Islanders, what do we see? But also, how are we interpreting what we see through our own culture, right? That's all. So, it would be nice if we could set aside our culture and look at things objectively. But I think you're right. I think it's not reasonable. It's just not possible, right? The best we can do is understand our own bias. Now, in the process of this article, we learn about a few important things. We learn a few important things about men and women in Trobriand society. And what are some of the things we learn about women in this society? What do we learn about women? I can't call your names because I don't know who any of you are yet. So you'll just you'll just have to put up your hand or speak out. I'll learn all your names, I promise, but I don't know everybody.
She talked about the productive work of women.
Right. So.
How they were productive.
So, in anthropology, when we talk about productive work, it's like the work of producing something, right? It could be food, it could be clothing, right? It could be tools. Something is being made, right? Something's being produced. And what are women producing here?
Kids.
What?
Kids.
Kids, definitely, right? Men have a minor role, of course, but it's not. Actually, we'll get to that because that comes up in this article, right? What are these women producing and then exchanging?
Fabrics and banana leaves.
Yeah, so they have these big banana leaves, right? And there's bundles of them. They exchange them with each other. They sometimes make skirts out of them and things like that. So women are kind of producing and exchanging things, right? Which of course was kind of news to Annette Weiner because Malinowski didn't really talk about that, did he? What else do we kind of learn about? Actually, let's just open it up. What do we learn about women, or what do we learn about men?
You're not given the equal
Uh,
time.
in Malinowski's
Yeah.
work, yeah, Malinowski spent more time on men, right? Very true, and we'll come back, we'll circle back to that one. What else do we learn about men and women?
Father is given more importance in life of a child.
Right. So the father is more important in the life of a child than.
Then mother's brother.
Yes, or at least more than what Malinowski described, right? So maybe they didn't really explain in the article very well because it's not the main point of the article, but the Trobriand Islanders have a really interesting and different way of constructing their families, right? So I think probably everyone in this room at one time or another, hopefully, or maybe, you had a mother and father and children, and the mother and father lived together, right? Or the intent is that they would live together. Sometimes you live with grandparents of one side or the other, but that's usually how we kind of construct our families, right? Around the mother and the father and the kids. But for the Trobrians here, it's very different. The family is constructed around the mother, her children, and her brothers and sisters. Okay? So if I'm a man, well, I am a man. If I'm a man in Trobriand society, then the kids that I'm raising and the kids that I'm really responsible for are actually my sister's children, not mine. Okay? So my children, they're the responsibility of my wife's brother. Yeah, of my brother-in-law. So they kind of, we divide our families this way, and they kind of divide their families the other way, right? And so, again, if you're a kid in Trobriand culture, mostly you're raised by your mom and her brothers and sisters, right? That's really your close family, right? And your father is kind of over there. He's in a different lineage, okay? So, again, it's kind of odd, right? It's kind of different than what we're used to. As it turns out, it's not very common in world cultures. Most cultures do it the way that we all do it. But the Trobrians are a little bit different, right? So they divide up their families a little differently. And as we heard, the fathers of children actually do have an important role to play in the lives of these children, right? Malinowski said no, the father's off, looking after his sister's kids. He doesn't really have a lot of influence in the life of his own children. But Annette Weiner says, yeah, it's not true, actually. It seems that they do. What kind of things do children get from their father? Yeah. Love, yeah, absolutely. Well, hopefully, right? Hopefully they get that. What else do they get? Property? In your culture or theirs?
Both.
In both? I think you're guessing. Let me see. Actually, no. In this culture, you would get land from your mother's side of the family. because the rights to land are held within the mother's line. So nice try. But it's true. You would get some things from the father, right? And they're not super specific here, right? They say that there's some access to resources, right, and gifts and opportunities. Again, they're pretty vague in the article, but that's okay. The father has things to offer.
What if they don't have a brother?
Let's see. If you don't have a brother.
I don't have a brother.
True. I suspect that Trobriand families are probably a little bit bigger than maybe some of the families we're from. You would probably go and live with the family, like with another relative, right? And maybe they, like a cousin, and cousin would kind of fulfill that role for you, I think. That's a good question. I hadn't thought of that, but I'm sure there would be a place for you if you didn't have a brother. What else do we learn about men and women here?
Men have little authority over their own children.
Uh,
A father would be like called a stranger.
Right, and who said that, Malinowski or Weiner? Yeah, Malinowski said that, right? So he kind of, when he wrote his book, he said, yeah, fathers are kind of strangers. They don't really have any role in their children's lives. But then Annette Weiner says, actually, they do, right? Fathers do play some kind of role in the lives of their kids, right? So we have kind of two different pictures forming here. What else do we learn about men and women? What else do we learn about men and women?
They live separately.
Say again?
Husband, wife live separately from each other.
Right, husbands and wives live separately from each other, right? Which again is probably different from what we're used to. Women living with their brothers and sisters, right? And men kind of doing the same. That's true. What else? Yeah.
They follow a matrilineal principle.
Yep. And what does that mean to you, matrilineal?
Matrilineal basically means that most of the inheritance and most of the raising of
Yep.
the child, or a lot of the responsibility for the child, will be put on the mother or the mother's side of the family.
Yes and no. For the most part, yes, right? So matra is the, I think, the Greek for mother, right? Matras is mother, line is line, right? So matrilineal is mother's line, right? So societies like this that are matrilineal, they figure out who their family is based on their mother's side of the family, right? The father's side of the family, they belong to another matrilineage, right? They belong to another family. And I think, would I be wrong to say that all of us in this room, or would I be correct to say that all of us in this room count our mother's side of the family and our father's side of the family as part of our family? Yeah, right? Sometimes or often the father's side of the family is kind of more important, right, or more influential, but we kind of think of both sides as our family, right? But the Trobrians are different, right? So the Trobrians, your mother's side of the family, that's your family. Your father's side, they belong to another matrilineage, another group of people, right? But still, there's connections between these two, right? Let me see the role of women. Is there anything we missed that's important about men or women? They kind of have a different way of organizing their families. Okay, let me skip to number 5, because number 5 is the meaty part of this. So we've established that Branislaw Malinowski went to the same place. They did the same thing, right? They did anthropology, cultural anthropology there. And they did it with the same group of people, right? These Trobriand islanders living on the Trobriand islands did the same thing. But their findings and the books that they wrote, the ethnographies that they wrote, had some differences, right? They weren't quite the same story. They didn't quite give the exact same picture of this culture. And so the question is, why? Why did these two researchers create two slightly different pictures of a culture? Isn't a culture just a culture? What?
They're two different authors, right?
Okay.
And then they came in a different period of time.
Okay.
Malinowski like went like years before.
Yeah.
And she went like after.
Okay.
And she's a woman. She's Asian.
Perfect. Okay. I'm going to press pause on you for a second. So one of the things that Sabrina said was, indeed, these are two different people, right? And one of the ways in which they're different is Branislaw Malinowski is a man and Annette Weiner is a woman. So why would that make a difference? Why would that make a difference?
Because a man would not see like a lot of things a woman would see in a different way. Like if like he mentioned about the woman not being treated equally, right?
Right?
So that's something a woman would see, but a man would probably take it normally because of the culture that they were using.
The Trobriand culture or Branislaw
Our
and Annette's
cultures-
culture?
Our culture basically does teach us like men are superior than women, right?
Okay. So there's a couple things going on there, right? One of which is that, well, and Annette Weiner says it, right? She said that Branislaw Malinowski didn't seem to give a lot of attention to women's activities. He seemed to focus on men's activities, right? And traditionally in our culture, and I'll leave you to decide if your cultures apply as well, but men's work has been seen as more important, right? More interesting, more legitimate. And so when Branislaw Malinowski goes to the Trobriand Islands, what does he do? Well, he focuses on the men, right? Because that's who's doing the important work, right? It's the men. So what are they doing? Right? And he starts writing. So Annette Weiner here kind of identifies the fact that there's a little bit of bias, right? That men might focus on men's work because they think it's more important, right? Sabrina, you also mentioned time, right?
Yeah, the period of time, maybe like it evolved.
Okay.
Like, I mean, if you looked at our culture,
Yeah.
like back then, women aren't supposed to vote. Now that we are.
Right.
Yeah, that's like a long discussion, but.
Yeah, but cultures change over time, do they not? Is your culture the exact same as it was 60 years ago? No, right? We're all caught in a period of kind of rapid cultural change, right?
People kind of shape culture into what makes them comfortable.
Yeah, right? Yeah, culture's always being kind of remade and reformed, right? Parts of it stay the same and are traditional, parts get changed, right? So could the Trobriand culture have changed in 50 or 60 years? Sure, right? Probably not at the rate that ours has, I imagine, but yeah, it definitely could have changed.
So you're saying that a man raised in a patriarchal society would have a completely different perspective compared to a woman who grew up in a modern world?
I think that's very possible, right? Especially, and you may not know this part, but in academia, especially in the early part of the 20th century, most of the science and the writing and the academics was being done by men, right? Professors were men, scientists were men, right? And so again, they tended to focus on man things. But as the sort of 20th century went on, we got into the 1950s and 60s, and women started to enter academia and enter science in greater numbers. Women started to kind of restore that balance, right? Women got into these fields and said, hey, you guys have been looking at men's stuff for hundreds of years, but there's another half of the story to be told here, right? There's a missing piece, right? You've been ignoring women this whole time. And so many women scholars kind of set out purposely to restore that balance, right? To tell the stories of women, to study things from women's perspectives, right? And Annette Weiner, I don't really know her, to be honest, but she's probably one of them, right? She's probably one of these scientists who were specifically looking at places where men might have, things men might have ignored, right? So, yeah, you're very correct. What's your name in the back there? Marco. Marco's very correct, right? In that Branislaw Malinowski definitely grew up in a kind of male-centered patriarchal society. Annette Weiner is kind of part of the modern world, right? She's a modern woman, and she's looking at things from a totally different perspective. So, not only could Trobriand culture have changed, but Western culture changed as well, right? In those 60 years. So, two cultures have changed within that period, and we have a little bit of maybe gender or sex bias, right? Because Branislaw Malinowski is a man and Annette Weiner is a woman. Right? What else? Why else might we have seen differences in these two analyses? Why else might they have been different? What do you mean?
I mean, different cultures view different things differently, so maybe we will view it differently because of their own cultures.
Oh, that's interesting.
It's just like one point.
So Branislaw Malinowski, I'm not sure if you know, Branislaw Malinowski was from Austria. So he was from the Austro-Hungarian Empire. That's why he got stuck in the Trobrians in the first place, because the First World War broke out, and the Trobrians were controlled by the British, and they wouldn't let him go home. So he's from Austria, and Annette, I believe, is American, right? So now, not only has Western culture, whatever that is, not only has that changed, but there are actually two different cultures that are analyzing it, right? An Austrian and an American, right? So that's interesting. We have two different genders, two different time periods, two different nationalities or cultural backgrounds. We have a Trobriand culture that might have changed over time. Whew. So no wonder they saw anything the same at all, right? What else might explain these differences? There's more. There's at least two more things. These two more things. Why?
There could be a difference in human perspective. Even though they are evolved in the same culture,
Yeah.
but the perspective of one human could be different from another.
Certainly, right? These are Annette and Branislaw are unique individuals, right? And everybody sees things a little bit differently, right? Even if we're from the same culture, we're our own unique people, right?
Biology of women and men,
Okay, how so?
like men are more dominant and more physically dominant than women. That's why there is a psychology behind it, like more men are more dominant. That's why we get in culture
Okay.
the dominance of men. We can see dominance of men in culture. That's because of psychology and the biology of men and women.
Okay, so assuming that's true, how does it create the difference between the two? I see where I think I see where you're trying to go. I just want to confirm that if that's where you're going. Let me think about that one for a minute. Okay. Other reasons why there might be a difference. Okay. Yeah.
Like, so, because they went on a different time period of time, right? Probably the people that most people talk to or like observe is already dead by the time.
Likely that's true, right? So I guess that's the individual comment, right? In that Branislaw and Annette are different people, and they would have talked to different people as well, right? So there's some individual differences there.
Is it that because they went in different times, there's a different difference in the collection of the ethnographic data, like the way that they go about collecting data.
Interesting. So you're suggesting that maybe anthropology itself has changed. Yeah. And absolutely it did, right? If you know anything about science, scientists are constantly trying to do things better, right? They're trying to create better theories, better data collection methods, better analyses, right? Old theories are disproven or not useful, and so they throw them out and create something new. And so, yeah, this is, in the discipline of anthropology, 60 years is a long time, right? So the way in which Annette is doing her anthropology is probably not the same as the way Branislaw did it, right? Different theoretical perspectives, right? Different approaches produces different results, right? That's a good one too. And I think there's probably one more, and it has to do with sex, or it has to do with gender. Just one more, I think, if I'm remembering correctly. Let me ask you this. When you're hanging out with your same-sex friends, so ladies, when you're hanging out with your girlfriends, or guys, when you're hanging out with your guy friends, with your bros, are there things that you talk about with those same-sex friends that you don't talk about with the opposite sex? 100% there is, right? And it's on both sides, right? Ladies, I know there's stuff you talk about that you do not talk about with us guys, and likewise, it's the other way, right? So that's interesting too, because these two anthropologists are different genders, right? And so not only do they kind of approach things differently as a man or as a woman, but when they go into a culture, they're not invisible, are they? People see them as the gender they are, right? People saw Branislaw Malinowski as the man that he was. The Trobrians saw Annette Weiner as the woman that she was. And so might that have affected what they told that person? Yeah, right? I'm sure that Branislaw Malinowski heard things that the Trobrians never would have told Annette Weiner, right? As a woman? No, right? We never would have said that to her. But I'm sure that Annette Weiner also heard things, probably from the women, that Branislaw Malinowski would have never heard, right? Those Trobrian ladies never would have told Branislaw the things they told Annette Weiner, right? So cultures themselves interact with the anthropologist, because the anthropologist is not invisible, right? They are a human person with a gender, and people treat them that way. And so sometimes as a woman, you learn things, or you see things, or you hear things that as a man you wouldn't, and vice versa, right? There's always certain things that are kind of, men's talk or men's sphere of things, and women's talk or women's sphere of things. And oftentimes it's hard to kind of go between those two worlds, right? In some cultures it's easier. In some cultures, very difficult to go between those two worlds.
Maybe because she's a woman, she saw a woman problems more.
Yeah. And definitely, right? She might have heard more from the women in that regard, and she may have focused on them more, right? Again, maybe she felt Branislaw Malinowski had missed out, right? He hadn't sort of fully described women's way of life there. And again, maybe that was part of her approach, right? Is she's like, yes, I'm going to the Trobriand Islander, or yes, I'm going to the Trobriand Islands, but in particular, I really want to look at the lives of women. I really want to see what their lives are like, and what things they're doing and why they're doing those things, right? So she may have purposely set out to do that. That may have been her intention, right? Whereas Branislaw Malinowski, probably wasn't his intention. And in fact, I assume his intention was to just describe the whole culture, but I think he probably did it in a very male-centric way, because that's kind of the culture and the time period he comes from. So that's a lot of differences, right? Those people are different, anthropology is different, Trobriand culture is different. Trobriand culture is interacting with these two people differently. Holy cow, right? I can't believe that they even saw anything the same, right? But they did, right? And again, this doesn't mean that Branislaw's book is less legitimate than Annette Weiner's. It's just that they've looked at this thing in a different way, right? They've looked at it from a different perspective. And so really combining the two gives us a better picture. It's not necessarily about a right versus wrong thing. So that's kind of the answer to, I meant to kind of redo some of these questions, but that's kind of the answer to question 4 right there, is that anthropology is a discipline that is in motion, right? Things change. New theories appear, old theories are thrown out, right? Ways we used to do things are modified, right? We do things in a new way because they teach us something new, right? And again, all sciences, all fields are like that, right? They're constantly trying to do things better. And so the way that they did things in 1916, just probably not the way we do things today, right? Hopefully we have better ways to analyze our data. Whew, there was a lot to talk about in there, I didn't lie. Okay, would you like to take a little break?
Yeah.
Okay.
Of course.
Yes, so we're going to take a quick break, about 10 minutes. We'll come back and then we'll start our next unit because we're kind of done with the culture stuff. So we'll switch it up, okay? let's jump back in. So, we've kind of talked a little bit about what anthropology is. We've talked a little bit about what culture is. We've talked about kind of how cultural anthropologists do their work and kind of the maybe challenges of trying to describe a culture. That's what we were talking about with Annette Weiner. Here we're going to talk about the beginnings of human culture. And I'm going to try not to get too carried away with this because I actually think this is really interesting, and I could probably spend like a long time dealing with it, but I'll try to keep it within the amount of time that we have. I think it's really interesting. I took whole courses on this in university, so it's interesting to me. Maybe it'll be interesting to you too, though. But the whole point of this part of the course, the whole point of this unit, is to look at the very beginnings of human culture, right? And I think maybe the first class we had, I asked you the question, well, what makes humans so different from other living things, right? Why are you guys so special, right? And one of the things that is special about us is that we have culture, right? We have language. We have big complicated brains that can build things, right? You told me all of those things. And part of the question of why we're so different has to do with where we come from, right? Our evolution and our kind of evolutionary story. So in this section of the course, we'll talk about not only how we're different and how we're unique, but also why, right? Why we've kind of turned into the animals that we've turned into, okay? And again, this is the evolutionary perspective. This is the science perspective. Your religion or faith might describe the origin of humans differently, and I'm not here to debate that. We're just going to learn about what science says, okay? Lots of traffic. Okay. But I'm not going to close the door just so air continues to circulate, because that's good. Right. So the first thing to know is if we're going to look at humans and humans' evolutionary story, humans are animals, right? And so, many of us would like to think that we are different, that we are more, and in many ways we are more. But at a very basic biological level, we are living organisms like everything else, right? And so hundreds of years ago, Carl Linnaeus, among others, started to figure out a system to organize and name and classify living things, right? And so he came up with a system that organized living things according to their similarity and gave them a two-part name, right? And the names are in Latin. I was going to say usually, but I think always they're in Latin. They have a genus and a species, right? And your species name is something that, or our species name is something that only we have, but our genus, which happens to be Homo, there are other creatures in that genus, although all of them are extinct at the moment, right? So, so the sort of way that these things are organized is according to species, which is unique to one particular kind of animal, a genus, which generally has a bunch of species in it, a family, which has a bunch of genera in it, that's the plural, and an order has a bunch of families, and so on and so forth, right? And so as you go up, you get things that are kind of more generally related to each other. As you go down, you find things that are more specifically related to each other, right? And usually more similar to look at, right? So here, if you looked at the animal kingdom, for instance, we have a bunch of different phyla, right? So there are vertebrates, there are things with a backbone, right? There are annelids, which I think are worms of some type. There are mollusks, right? Things with shells like snails. There's nematodes, which I think are another type of worm. Don't quote me on that one. There's arthropods, right? Things that have a hard, crusty outside. And then, of course, within vertebrates and within arthropods, we have a bunch of different creatures, right? And so, again, as we kind of travel down the family tree, we get to things that are more and more similar. Whoops. If we look at mammals, for instance, so if we look at the class of mammals, you'll see that there are many, many orders. And I think if I was using my PowerPoint, I'd be able to read those, but I can't. All of these are different orders of mammals here. And so here we have kind of rabbits and things that are related to rabbits. Here we have rodents, right? Rats and mice and things. All through here we have, what do we have in here? These are, I think, predatory mammals here. Or no, these are carnivores here. These are mammals with hooves mostly. I think we've got horses toward the top and maybe camel-like things up there. So we have everything kind of organized according to similarity, right? But of course, the order we're interested in here are primates, because that's what you all are, you primates, and me too. we're all primates, right? And so if we look at this order of primates, you'll see there's more primates than this, but these are kind of some of the major types. And as you can see, we all share a common ancestor, right? So somewhere in the very distant past, maybe around 50 million years ago, there's an animal that kind of gave rise to all of our different species, right? And you can see some of these types of animals here at the top. And if we were to kind of look at, similar picture, if we were to look at pictures of them, we would see that some of them are more similar to us and some of them are less similar, right? So the first primates that were around probably looked something like this. This is a lemur. Very interesting creatures, right? Kind of looks like a cross between a monkey and a raccoon. Very interesting creatures, but you can probably see, what feature do you think is the most like us on this creature? What? Yeah, right? Look at those 1, 2, 3, 4, and then a thumb, right? So you see very early on the appearance of a hand that doesn't look exactly like us, but it's somewhat similar, right? And so, yeah, animals that look like lemurs show up maybe around 50 million years or so. There's other types of primates too. This is a loris, I believe. Man, they're cute, right? They're like little teddy bears come to life. Although you shouldn't domesticate them, it's not good for them. But if you YouTube search, for lorises later on, you'll be in for some cute videos, because that's okay, because they're like little teddy bears come to life, really cute. The same cannot be said for all primates. This is a tarsier. He looks like he's had way too much caffeine, and he's just like wired. But again, you can see that hand, right, is somewhat similar to ours, and maybe a bit of the face too, right? They have eyes in the front of their head just like we do, even though those eyes are pretty freaky, actually. Pretty freaky. Probably familiar with primates like this, right? 2 capuchin monkeys, one that owes the other one money. It's like, come on, dude. It's been 3 weeks already. Pay up. We have various types of baboons, right? So this is a gelada. They live in Ethiopia. Man, that's a face, hey? The males have really stretchy skin on their face, and so they can their upper lip, they can kind of flip it back over their gums. So it looks like so all you can see is like gums and teeth and the big canines, and if it looks intimidating to you, that's because that's what it's supposed to be. It's supposed to be intimidating to other males. They're wild creatures. Gorillas, of course, also related to us. Somewhat similar, but also somewhat different, right? They are massive and strong, but vegetarians, interestingly enough. And then we come to these guys, right? And so chimpanzees and bonobos, who look almost the same as this, they're very similar to us, right? Genetically speaking, they're about 98.4% the same as us. So even though that 1.6% makes a lot of difference, there's actually a lot of similarity here, right? And so, again, it's very useful to look at chimpanzees to kind of think about our own species, but also we're quite a bit different from them in the way that we organize ourselves and behave, even though we're much more sophisticated. Right? And again, the reason why we have all of these different species, the reason why some are more similar to us and some are different, have to do with their genetic code, right? And again, what's that? Yeah, exactly. And so I'm sure for some of you, this might be somewhat new material. I'm sure for some of you, it might not be. But we'll just do a little bit on DNA just to make sure we're all on the same page, okay? So I know you may have done this before. So the sort of study of genetics and the study of DNA and evolution has to do with the questions of how are there so many species and how do they come about, right? Why do we have so many different types of animals and plants around the world, and all of them seem to be just so specialized and fit so perfectly into their environment, right? How does that happen, okay? And so to kind of describe this, I just wanted to show you a quick video, but of course, we probably shouldn't talk about genetics at all without mentioning Mr. Charles Darwin, right? And he, of course, wrote two very important books back in the 1800s, The Voyage of the Beagle, which was a ship that he was on, and On the Origin of Species, right? And he actually has an interesting backstory too. I think, if I remember the story, his dad wanted him to be a lawyer or something like this. And so he kind of forced him to go to law school, and Charles Darwin went to law school, but he hated it all the way through. And so I think he kind of finished, and he didn't really want to be a lawyer. And then he got the opportunity to go on a scientific voyage, right? They were going to go to the Galapagos Islands, which are off the coast of South America, and do some studying there. And so he kind of jumped at the chance to not do lawyer stuff and to go and do this. And so he did, and sailed off, not really knowing what he was getting into, not really knowing why he was going in the first place. But again, he arrived at these islands and kind of marveled at the fact that these tiny islands way off in the middle of the Pacific had so many different kinds of animals living on them, and animals that didn't live on the mainland in South America. And it kind of caused Charles Darwin to think, well, how is that possible, right? Why are there so many different types of creatures here that are kind of so perfectly designed for their environment, okay? And so, again, to kind of flesh this out, I just wanted to watch a short video. It's animated and kind of cute. If you know all about, evolution and natural selection and, genetics, then just sit back and enjoy. If you don't, this will be a good starting point for us, okay? So just give me 2 seconds here. I've just got to reconfigure my computer, and then, where's my remote? There we go. Okay.
Mechanisms of evolution. What is evolution? Evolution is the development of life on Earth. This is a process that began billions of years ago and is still continuing to this day. Evolution tells us how it was possible for the enormous diversity of life to develop. It shows us how primitive protozoa could become the millions of different species that we see today. Evolution, then, is the answer to the question that we have all asked on seeing a dachshund and a Great Dane together. How is it possible for ancestors to have descendants that look so very different to them?
which is actually not necessarily a good example because dogs are all the same species, even though they appear wildly different. They're the same thing, so not a great example, but that's okay.
In answering this question, we want to focus on animals, excluding other forms of life such as fungi and plants. The first question to ask is therefore, how can one animal develop into a whole new species of animal? But just a quick question. What exactly is a species? A species is a community of animals that is capable of producing offspring with one another, with those offspring also being capable of reproducing in turn. To understand this answer better, we need to take a closer look at the following points. The uniqueness of living creatures guaranteed through the excess production of offspring and heredity, and, as a second key point, selection. Let's begin with uniqueness. Every creature that exists is unique, and this is essential for evolution. The members of a species may strongly resemble each other in appearance, however, they all have slightly different traits and characteristics. They may be a bit bigger, fatter, stronger, or bolder than their fellow animals. So what is the reason for these differences? Let's take a closer look at a creature. Every creature is made up of cells. These cells have a nucleus. The nucleus contains the chromosomes, and the chromosomes hold the DNA. DNA consists of different genes, and it's these genes that are life's information carriers. They contain instructions and orders for the cells and determine the characteristics and traits that living creatures have. And it's precisely this DNA that is unique to every creature. It's slightly different from individual to individual, which is why each has slightly different characteristics. But how is the enormous range of DNA created? One key factor is the excess production of offspring. In nature, we can observe that creatures generally produce far more offspring than is necessary for the survival of their species, with many offspring dying an early death as a result. Often there are even more offspring than the environment in which they live is able to support. This is one factor in increasing diversity within a species. The more offspring that are produced, the more little differences occur. And this is what nature wants, as many little differences as possible. The second major cause of the uniqueness of individuals occurs in heredity itself. By the way, heredity means the passing on of DNA to offspring. Two very interesting factors come into play in this process: recombination and mutation. Recombination is the random mixing of the DNA of two creatures. When two creatures fall in love and mate, they recombine their genes twice. The first time they do this separately, when they generate the gametes, that is, sperm and egg cells. The gametes take half of the genes and shuffle them. The second recombination occurs when a male inseminates a female. The parents each provide 50% of their DNA, in other words, 50% of their unique traits and characteristics. These are then recombined or mixed, and the result is new offspring. These offspring have a random mix of the DNA, and therefore the traits and characteristics of their parents. This increases the diversity and differences within a species even further. But mutations are also important for evolution. Mutations are random changes in DNA. These can also be described as copying errors within the DNA, triggered by toxins or other chemical substances or by radiation. A mutation exists when a part of the DNA is altered. These changes are often negative and may result in illnesses such as cancer. However, they may also have neutral or positive effects, such as the blue eye color in humans, which is one such random mutation. In all cases, a mutation has to affect a gamete, that is, a sperm or egg cell, because only the DNA in the gametes is passed on to the offspring. This is also the reason why we protect our sexual organs during X-rays, whilst other parts of the body are not at risk. In summary then, in the heredity process, creatures pass on their characteristics to their offspring in the form of DNA. Recombination and mutation change the DNA so that each child looks different to its siblings and receives a random mix of the characteristics of its parents. There's a key word here: random. All of these processes are based on chance. Random recombination and mutations result in individuals with random mixes of traits and characteristics, which in turn mix these randomly and pass them on. But how can so much be down to chance when all living creatures are so perfectly adapted to their environment? For example, the stick insect, the hummingbird, and the frogfish. The answer is provided by the second key point, selection. Each individual is subjected to a process of natural selection. As we have learned, each individual is somewhat different to its fellows, and there is extensive variation within a species. Environmental influences have an effect on living creatures. These so-called selection factors include predators, parasites, animals of the same species, toxins, changes in habitat, or the climate. Selection is a process that each individual is subjected to. Every creature has a unique mix of traits and characteristics. This mix helps them to survive in their environment, or not, as the case may be. Anyone with an unsuitable mix will be selected from the environment. Those with the right mix survive and can pass on their enhanced traits and characteristics. This is why diversity is so important. This is why creatures make so much effort to produce offspring that are as different as possible. They increase the likelihood that at least one of their offspring passes nature's selection process. They maximize their chances of survival. A good example of this can be seen in a group of finches living on a remote island. They are some of the most famous animals in the world of science and are known as Darwin Finches after their discoverer, Charles Darwin. And this is the story of those finches. A few hundred years ago, a small group of finches was blown onto the Galapagos Islands in the middle of the Pacific, probably by a big storm. The finches found themselves in an environment that was completely new to them, a real finch paradise, an abundance of food, and no predators. They reproduced rapidly and numerously. The islands were soon heaving with finches. This meant that food supplies became increasingly scarce. The finch paradise was threatened with famine, and finch friends became competitors. This is when selection intervened. Their individuality and small differences, in this case their slightly different beaks, meant that some of the birds were able to avoid competing with their fellow finches. The beaks of some of the finches were more suitable for digging for worms. Other finches were able to use their beaks better for cracking seeds. The finches consequently sought out ecological niches. In these niches, they were safe from excessive competition. They soon began to mate primarily with other finches that used the same niche. Over the course of many generations, these characteristics were enhanced, enabling the finches to exploit their niches successfully. The differences between the worm diggers and the seed crackers became so large that they were no longer able to mate with one another. Different species emerged as a result. Today there are 14 different species of finch living on the Galapagos Islands, all of which are descended from the same group of stranded finches. This is how new species are created by evolution, through the interaction of unique individuals, the excess production of offspring, recombination and mutation in heredity, and finally, through selection. Why is this so important? It tells us where the variety of life comes from and why living creatures are so perfectly adapted to their habitats. But it also affects us personally. Every person is the result of 3.5 billion years of evolution. And that includes you. your ancestors fought and adapted in order to survive. This survival was an extremely uncertain thing. If we consider the fact that 99% of all the species that have ever lived are extinct, then you can consider yourself part of a success story. The dinosaurs have disappeared, but you are alive, watching this video. Because you're incredibly special.
Yay us.
Just like all the other creatures that exist today. Irreproducible and unique in the universe.
Okay, so some very dramatic music. I don't know why they felt the need to, sort of stoke our ego, saying, you're so special, but I guess we are. So kind of a strange video. Also at the end, I don't know what was going on with that. It looked like a war between humans and bears or something. I don't know. I don't know what it was. It was weird, right? But it is kind of a good explanation of, the laws of natural selection and heredity and genetics. After watching that, who kind of knew all that stuff already or didn't? So on a scale of 1 to 10, 1 being, gosh, I didn't know anything about that, or 10, yes, I knew all of that stuff already. Where are we? I'd just like to take the temperature here.
I think I'm at a 5.
About a
Like some of them, you know.
Okay, 5, 7, yeah, about 7. Okay, 10. You're
Sir, I have read in that was in my class 10 to 11. There was a chapter, one explanation about it.
okay.
So I came, it refreshes myself that.
Okay, so that's good, right? We have kind of a, most people, knew what DNA was and had a little bit of background, but it's a good, at worst, it's a good refresher, right? And at best, kind of tells us things that we need to know. And we do need to know these things or be aware of them because it does have to do with how our species evolved, right? So we all kind of went through this process of evolution, right? Our ancestors were all unique individuals, and they were tested, right? The environment tested them in various different ways, finding food, finding shelter, being kind of strong enough to avoid injury or to avoid infection from viruses, to avoid predators, right? To defend ourselves from others like us, right? We've all our ancestors were either strong enough to do that and lived long enough to pass on their genes, or they weren't, right? And they were kind of selected out. The way I kind of like to think about this, I don't know if anyone's come up with a better analogy, but have you ever had an exam and you're writing the exam and then you get to a question and you look at it and you're like, I've got nothing. I have no idea. I have no idea what to write here. The teacher's giving me like this much room. I don't know what the answer is. What do? Just go for it, right? Tell them everything you know. Just throw anything at them in the hopes that something is right? We've all done it, yes? Yeah, and that's exactly what species have to do, right? They're constantly creating multiple versions of themselves. They're all different and all unique, and they're kind of just throwing it at nature, hoping that something is the right combination, right? Something is the right combination of characteristics to be successful, right? So we've all done it on an exam, maybe to partial success or not, but animals and organisms do it as well, right? They're constantly trying to pass nature's test by producing as many different variations as they can, right? Some of those variations might be very adept and sort of survive very well. Some of them might not. Some of them might die very quickly because of a genetic mutation, but they just produce as much variation as they can in the hopes that part of their answer is correct, right? Which, again, we've probably all done. So one of the things that we'll also keep in mind here is something they said at the beginning, that a species is a community of animals that can interbreed with each other and can generate fertile offspring, right? Again, you can't pass your genes on if your offspring are not fertile, right? So you kind of need that to continue. The other thing we should, actually I didn't mean to do that, I meant to ban them because that's a spam thing. There we go. The Russians are really spamming me pretty hard these days. I don't know if it has to do with Ukraine or what it is, but last term, none of that. This term, like 2 or 3 a day. The Russians are trying to hack me. I don't know.
They want to learn anthropology.
They want to learn anthropology. Register and pay your tuition then, Russians. Actually, that's not true. It's on YouTube, right? So when we talk about evolution, we're talking about the process, right? The process of change of life on Earth, right? So evolution is a process of change, right? We'll also probably come up or the idea of natural selection will also come up in the next few classes too, right? And so that's the process of selecting which combination of genes are the most beneficial, right? And again, the ones that are the most beneficial, the best adapted to the environment, they'll live and pass on their genes to their offspring, right? Maybe multiple times, right? Maybe they'll have multiple kids. Maybe they're an animal that lays eggs and they'll lay thousands of eggs a few times in their life, right? Ones that are not as well suited, maybe they'll only pass on their genetics a couple times or once. And the ones that are not well suited, well, they'll either die or they won't be able to pass on their genetic material, right? So it's kind of a constant test, right? And the natural environment sets the conditions and organisms have to pass them, right? Or try to pass them if they can. An adaptation or an adaptive trait is something about an animal or an organism that kind of fulfills a need for them, right? It allows them to do something in the environment, okay? And again, every member of a species, every individual is unique, right? Even creatures that don't appear to be unique, those crows, those black birds that are always outside cawing away, they all look the same to me. I don't think I could tell one from the other. But genetically speaking, they're all unique animals, right? None of them is the same as the next one. It talked about heredity, right? The process of passing on our genetics from one generation to the other, and the importance of kind of reshuffling those genetics, right? So if you think about your parents, although you probably don't want to think about them in this context, but your dad's DNA was kind of reshuffled, your mom's DNA was reshuffled, and that was combined to form you, right? So every time a new offspring is produced, there's a reshuffling of that genetic code. So you can't produce another you, right? It's just not possible to shuffle all of those different genetic pieces and get exactly the same thing, right? We get some similar things because if we have siblings, we know that there are some similarities between us, but you just can't produce the same thing because the numbers of genes in your genetic code is just too large, right? And so you always get something unique. You always get something different. Again, there are these selective pressures, right? We have predators out in the environment, things that are trying to eat us. We have members of the same species that might try to kill us. Hopefully not, but happens sometimes. We have parasites, or we have viruses, right? We have various toxins or poisons that might kill us. Changes in our habitat, right? We might live in a place that was really warm and then it gets really cold, or it might have been really wet and it gets really dry. And so as these things constantly put pressure on us, the best versions, the best answers are the ones that get passed on, right? Yeah, and the idea that all species produce more offspring than they really need, right? Because again, nature knows, or species know, that eventually some of those are going to die, right? They're not going to make it through. Okay, so I'm going to press pause because what we're going to do on, it's today Tuesday, what we're going to do on Friday is look at a short piece of a documentary that talks a little bit about our evolution. And it's called Your Inner Fish. And so it's part of Neil Shubin here, who is a paleontologist and evolutionary biologist. He wrote a book called Your Inner Fish, and then they made it into a bit of a documentary. And so we're going to watch the section that's Your Inner Monkey. And so Neil will kind of take us through a little bit of our evolution. He'll show us some very interesting things and kind of show us how just a few of the features that make humans different from other animals, how those evolved and how those came to be. Okay? So it's kind of an interesting journey. There's not really a point in starting it now because we've got 5 minutes left. I know people are packing up because you're very eager to go, and I understand. I've got sushi to pick up, so I've got to do that too. But before I do, does anyone have any questions that they want to ask? Keep in mind that I lied actually. On Friday, we're going to have our first quiz, right? So you'll come in here. I'll hand you out a little paper. There'll be some multiple choice questions and a couple short answer questions and maybe a longer answer question. I might trim it down a little bit from that. It'll probably take about half the class or so. Then we'll have a break, then we'll come back, and then we'll look at your inner fish, okay? I can ask you anything I want from class or from the textbook, chapter 2. I tend to not ask anything from the sort of shaded sections of the textbook. So lots of the text is on white, and then there'll be, a section in orange or a section in purple. I don't usually ask anything from those sections. And if it's something from an article or something that we read, I won't ask you, I'll only ask you questions I've already asked before, okay? So we just talked about Annette Weiner and the Trobriand Islanders. I think I asked you 5 questions at the end of that. I might ask you one of those questions again, but I wouldn't just pull a random detail out of the article. That's not fair, okay? So we'll do that first quiz on Friday, then we'll get into this documentary. If you have any questions, you can always message me. But until then, I'll see you on Friday. Okay, that is it.